Hello, I'm Anita Harris, the author of The View from 3rd Street. I'm talking to you from my home office. Yesterday was the launch event for the book, which tells the story of my experiences at the Harrisburg Independent Press in the early 1970s. Some people were not able to log on to yesterday's Zoom, and I'm told that there were some technical issues. So I thought I would just re-record the speech for anybody who missed it yesterday. So first, I want to thank the Lincoln Public Library and my wonderful writers group, The Right Stuff, for helping me put on the book signing, and also my beta readers and friends for helping me get the book written and out. Some of those people were in the audience in Lincoln or on Zoom. Kitty Skank, Robin Rappaport, Jim Anderson, Rafi Hirsch, Kresha Richmond, Linda Grace Kobas, and there were a number of others. I'd also like to thank a number of people who put up with being in the book. Ed Zuckerman, Jim Wiggins, Fred, you know who you are. Also the wonderful librarians at MIT, the Concord, Massachusetts Library, and here in Lincoln, especially Kate, Robin, and Janet, who helped me with research and also morale through a long process. So it's been quite a journey. I first began working on The View from 3rd Street, which it was originally called HIP for the Harrisburg Independent Press, but one of my beta readers said, don't call it HIP at our age. People are going to think it's about your surgery or something like that. But anyway, I started working on it when Donald Trump was coming into office, and I was concerned about the divisiveness of that period. And it seemed to me that there might be parallels between the divisiveness at that point and when I got out of college and started the newspaper. Although who ever could have imagined that things now, well, that things could get so much worse. I mean, then we had Richard Nixon getting into trouble. I thought Donald Trump might make some mistakes, but didn't really expect what we've got now. In any case, I wanted to look at those earlier divisive forces in hopes that I could try and make some sense of the situation now. It was those divisive forces that propelled me into a career in journalism. I hoped understanding what had happened then would help me and others understand where we are today. I also hoped to show what it was like to be a young woman. I was 23 at the time, at that time of change, and what it was like to be a journalist at an independent publication. We had no real constraints because we had started it ourselves. And it was before the internet, before TikTok, Facebook, and today's difficult media landscape. I also wanted to show what it was like to be a journalist, what goes into the process, how it can affect other people's lives and one's own as a journalist. So back in the 70s, 50 years ago, it was a time of flux. We had early second wave feminism. There was a ton of anti-Vietnam War sentiment. There were civil rights demonstrations. There was violence in the streets. Oddly, a year out of Cornell, several friends and I all found ourselves in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, each for our own reasons. So we also happened to be there at the time when a major national trial, which came to be called the trial of the Harrisburg Seven, was about to start. In that trial, which has sometimes been called the trial of the century, a bunch of nuns and priests and such were accused by J. Edgar Hoover of conspiring to kidnap Henry Kissinger and blow up underground heating tunnels in Washington, D.C. True story. So I thought today I would tell you a bit about the founding of the newspaper, read a few excerpts from the book, and then wrap it up with a tale of what's happened since the book came out this summer. It's been really quite amazing. The book is written in 3 parts. I call them books because each focuses on a different subject. Book 1 is called The Paper, and it's about, well, the paper. Book 2 is about the trial. It's primarily about the trial with stuff about the paper and national and international events woven in. Book 3 is called The Flood. You can figure out what that means. And in that section, it talks about I talk about the paper, and also in the background, you've got the escalation of bombings in Southeast Asia. You have just all kinds of national events and international events happening. And finally, there are reports of some men breaking into some hotel called Watergate in Washington, D.C. And then it starts to rain. So as I mentioned, each of us was there for our own reasons. Ed Zuckerman, who had been the editor of the Cornell Daily Sun, was there because Vincent Blocker's father was the president of the Harrisburg Area Community College. He hired Ed to teach English and journalism. Fred Soloway was there. He had been a friend of the poet priest Daniel Berrigan at Cornell. Berrigan was the associate director of Cornell United Religious Work. And Fred was brought in, and his brother Philip was one of the accused priests who was going to be standing trial. Fred had been brought in to be the coordinator of what came to be known as the Harrisburg Seven Defense Committee. And I was there because I had worked in the Pennsylvania gubernatorial campaign of Milton J. Schaap, who happened to be my cousin. And in that campaign, I met a guy, and he moved to Harrisburg when Schaap won, worked for the administration. And a year after some adventures in Philadelphia and around the world, I moved in with my boyfriend, Ward, in Harrisburg. I gotta say, so Ward was not actually his name. His name was actually Edward. But between Edward Zuckerman and this Edward, I couldn't have 2 men with the same name as main characters in the book. So I changed, I used the second syllable of my boyfriend's name. Of course, at 23, I was fairly mixed up. I mean, mixed up now. So that's how things go. But the world had changed since I went to college. I'd grown up in the 1950s when we wore circle pins and villager sweaters and skirts and penny loafers. And by the time we graduated from Cornell, some fellow students, it was from a class in French Lit called Existentialism and Revolution that I happened to be in. Some of my classmates ended up, they were Black students who took over the student union building on Parents' Weekend, emerging with rifles and making it to the cover of, I think, Time magazine. There were then, at that time, between 1966 and 1970, the beginnings of what we now call second wave feminism. There were gay rights, there was huge anti-war protest. And starting college, I'd kind of expected, I'd hoped to be a writer, but what my family expected was that I would be a mom, a traditional woman. I would have a family and no real career. So at this time, 1 year out of college, I was trying to figure out what it meant to be a woman in the early 1970s without losing touch with who I had been brought up to be. you'll see that in the book. I call myself Ani. I needed to do that, to change my name slightly to get some distance. Ani happens to be the first three letters of my first name, and mercifully, it also means I in Hebrew, so I think I can get away with it. Although Channing Wag from the Right Stuff, my writers group, told me you cannot use that name. I said, why not? He said, because it means cuckoo bird in Portuguese. What will agents think? And so I thought, well, cuckoo bird, that could work. And agents didn't seem to be interested in it anyway, so I stayed with that. So here, what I'd like to do is tell you about the HIP organizing meeting. Oh, I should also mention that this week is the anniversary of the first issue of HIP, which came out first October 8th, 1971. So I go to the Harrisburg Peace Center, and Fred says, join us. They're all sitting at a table in this, in a room, maybe on card chairs. I'm not really sure. So Fred is 5'8" maybe, and stocky. He's got a thick black mustache, black hair, almost chin length, and it's partly swept across his forehead, and it's held back by a blue and white bandana. He's wearing sandals and a dark brown and beige pattern dashiki. You probably know that's a loose-fitting African-style garment favored by members of the Black Power movement and also by hippies at that time. Later, an unidentified FBI informer will describe Fred as, quote, wearing robes and ropes instead of conventional clothing and smelling bad from infrequent bathing. And Fred will quip, I showered every day, but you know how hard it is to get odor out of robe. Anyway, as Ani takes a seat, she nods and says hello to the tiny pert woman with the short salt and pepper hair across from her. Fred says, this is Mary Walsh. She's involved in the American Civil Liberties Union and the Unitarian Church. She even marched down south with Martin Luther King. She's been working with us on the Harrisburg Defense Committee. So Ani says, oh, that's great. Nice to meet you, Mary. Mary smiles and says hello. So at this point, Fred tells us about the trial. He explains about the nuns and the priests and how and why Hoover went after them, and that the Defense Committee wants to do something for the Harrisburg community. One thing being a newspaper that would cover the trial and the town. He then turns the meeting over to Ed Z. And as mentioned, Ed had been the editor of the Cornell Daily Sun. And he explains that he wants the paper to be an independent newspaper, writing in the same style as the Wall Street Journal. It will look like the Cornell Daily Sun, but it will cover issues that the mainstream press or the establishment press won't get involved with. The goals are going to be to make sure that the trial is covered fairly, and that as an alternative newspaper, we might take a stance that might be slightly different. Well, that we would cover things that weren't ordinarily covered by what we call the establishment press. So they offered me a choice. I could either work with the Defense Committee and the Peace Center or the paper. I'd always wanted to be a writer, so there was no question. I said the paper. So Ed Z says, okay, you can be the associate editor. I'm going to read here a little. So Ani does not think to ask what the job entails, but she does manage to ask, what does it pay? Fred, who will later deny it, says, you live with Ward. You don't need a salary. Ed Z says, that's true. Of course, he and Ed will each be making $25 a week. They're living in a house financed by the Defense Committee for free. It's 1971. It's the beginning of women's rights. Mary Walsh breaks in. No, Ani does need to be paid. It should be $35, even if that's the highest amount anyone gets. Fred says, that's ridiculous. well, Ani recalls that later. Fred does not. In fact, he will later deny even having been at the meeting. Oh, well. But to Ani's amazement, Ed Z says, okay. He looks Ani in the eye and says sternly, if we pay you $35 a week, we own you. Ani thinks that will be fine. As mentioned, Ed Z is tall and thin. And Ani will, it turns out, spend as much time looking at his ass in blue jeans as possible. Anyway, Ed Z really taught me everything I know about journalism, and I will be ever grateful to him. He was a great editor. But one of the first stories I ever covered in the third issue is probably the best story I ever wrote in my entire life. We got a call from Carolyn Jones at a local community center. She told us that a number of migrant workers had escaped from a migrant camp about, I don't know, 30, 40 miles out in the country. And they said that they had been held at gunpoint and forced to pick tomatoes. And if there were no tomatoes, weeds. None of the other news outlets would touch the story, would we? So I had answered the phone. I said yes. So what ended up happening was Ed Z and I went and interviewed the migrants at the community center, and they told just such a tale. They'd been, their wages had been withheld for no reason. It was the wages were very low. Men, really, they told us about the men with the guns. Women were, they didn't use the word rape, but forced to sleep with crew leaders and such. So at the end of the conversation, Ed drove me back into the HIP offices, and he said, that's going to be an amazing story, but we should really check it out. So I called the Labor Department of the state. The press secretary said, I'll get right back to you. And about half an hour later, he called back and he said, well, you're going to find this out anyway. We gave an award of excellence about a week ago to that migrant camp. So that was really something. And I don't know if, I probably didn't think to do this on my own, but probably Ed would have said to me, I think you should go out and look at the camp. So I called the farmer. His wife answered. She said he wasn't there. I said, well, we heard you won an award for excellence, and we just want to come report on the camp. So she said, that's fine, and gave us directions. And the next day, John Serbell and I drove out to the migrant camp. And John Serbell was a wonderful guy. He was a Vietnam vet. He'd been in the Navy, and a wonderful photographer. And he was also our ad salesman. But so John and I went out to this camp, and it's true. It's really was disgusting. There's to this day, you could see the pictures. Some of the pictures I've included in the book. But there are flies on the walls of the kitchen. There are charred marks behind where some rudimentary stoves were in these wood shacks that the people lived in. There was garbage strewn all over the road, and there were bottles, old wine and beer bottles everywhere. So we came back, and I did some more checking. The Labor Department put me in touch with their representatives and social workers who confirmed that they knew the camp and that it was this way. I might mention that Milton Schaap, the governor, was a liberal, and he strongly supported Cesar Chavez and the grape strike out in California, to the extent of even forbidding any of his agencies from serving grapes until the strike ended. So at the end of the year, someone from the Labor Department called me and he said, Anita, I want to tell you that as a result of your story, we have shut down that migrant camp and banished the crew leader from the state. So at 23, that was pretty heady. And I was pleased to understand that as one person, however young, I could have an impact. But I will say, when I read this piece, this part to my writers group, Marianne Hales, who, thank you for coming to the launch, Marianne. Marianne said, that must have been so frightening. And I said, well, no, I mean, I was a reporter. You just do your job. You don't feel fear. You don't have opinions. You just report. But after she said that, the next day, I went back to the manuscript and I started to feel fear. And then I started to realize all of the stuff from back then really was kind of frightening. And I think that I was carrying these memories of a lot of stuff from 50 years ago that I had never recognized were carried emotion with them. So the whole book became revisiting a lot of that. And so it was kind of a challenge to get it all out without being upset all the time. So anyway, we wrote all kinds of stories. One time, I don't know how I got the nerve to do this, but I sneaked into the local newspaper because some reporters told us there was a notice on the bulletin board saying, in the newsroom, saying that it was showing some conflict of interest on the part of the publisher. Other people wrote funny stories, reviews, the heroin trade, the courts, the legislature. I mean, it was really so amazing. And at one point, our offices even got trashed. Someone wrote in red stencil, "This paper exploits women," which really kind of pissed me off. It could have been from the dirty movie ads, though, that many of the people in the Catholic left and other religious people did not appreciate, but they were important to us because they, by and large, provided a lot of our income. So anyway, so that's some about the paper. Then the trial starts, and I'm not going to give this away, but I will just say that, so Philip Berrigan, Daniel Berrigan's brother, the priest, was in prison for destroying draft cards and such. In prison, from prison, he's corresponding with a nun, Sister Elizabeth, in New York. A fellow convict is allowed to go to a local university, Bucknell, for study release, and he offers to take Berrigan's letters to the university, where librarians helped send them to Sister Elizabeth. This way, Berrigan and Elizabeth avoided being scrutinized by the prison system. Unfortunately for Father Phil and Sister Elizabeth, Boyd Douglas, who was going to carry the letters, was an FBI informant. So that's really where Hoover got the idea of putting these people on trial, and the letters were very instrumental in the indictment. So in book 3, paper continues. Ed Zuckerman goes to cover the vets in Florida. The new editor, Jim Wiggins, comes in. Ed Zuckerman writes very wryly and kind of cynically. Jim Wiggins is humorous, but very serious at the same time. I got to say, some really funny things happened. One time, somebody wrote an article called "Whores, Cadillacs, and the Vice Squad," and it was a view. It was on 3rd Street. So, and there was a picture of a Cadillac in front of a bar that was kind of across the street from us. After the article came out, the bar owner came in and he was furious. He said, "You're going to ruin my business. It's terrible to have that picture of the Cadillac parked in front of my bar." And so we kind of apologized, I guess. No one can really remember what we really did, but But I remember that later that day, a young woman comes in and she's got very long hair, very high heels, and a very short skirt. And she says, she's furious too at the article. She says, because I never did it for $15 in my entire life. So I apologized to her. I asked her if she would write for the paper, but she never came back. So anyway, I mentioned about the escalation of the war and violence and demonstrations and bombings, even in this country. And then it starts to, and then Watergate, and then it starts to rain. And I just, as it began to rain, I covered one of the craziest legislative debates I've ever heard, and it was on abortion. And the Pennsylvania legislature had already ratified the Equal Rights Amendment, and a commission had recommended saying that abortion would be okay. But in this legislature, you had similar lines from the anti-abortion people and the so-called, I'll just call them pro-abortion people, and they were debating two bills. And when the pro-abortion debate came first, and during that debate, one of the legislators said it was ridiculous to call abortion murder, because if you called it murder, then you'd have to electrocute. I mean, the death penalty was also on the table in Pennsylvania at that time, but you'd have to electrocute the woman who had the abortion and her husband. And at this point, this huge applause and cheering erupts from the anti-abortion people in the balcony. The pro-abortion bill dies very quickly. There were like 8, maybe 14 votes to 80 something. I'm not sure of the exact numbers. And then the anti-abortion debate begins. And one legislator points out, he says, it's not an issue of women's rights, it's human rights to disallow abortion because there are male and female fetuses. Okay. And then another anti-abortion guy gets up, and it becomes like a Looney Tunes debate where he says, I'm just going to read you. He stands up and says that I'm sorry, I can't find it. He says that he was raised by prostitutes, just like you, Mr. So-and-so, referring to a Black senator. And they start calling each other names and saying they were raised by Black mammies, and it was really kind of nutty. But the anti-abortion bill was passed. The governor vetoed it, but not before a woman made public that one of the anti-abortion legislators had paid for her abortion. In any case, that was 6 months before Roe v. Wade was passed and abortion was legalized nationwide. Anyway, the book ends with the flood and we were evacuated, my boyfriend and I, and I'm going to just, so for me or for Ani, who reports on it all, it's politics, nature, and human nature that collide in a climax that impacts the town, the nation, politics, Ani's relationship with Ward, and basically her world. So that's how the book ends. So the book came out in June. I got it out in time for the commemoration of the flood, the 50-year commemoration. And I'd wanted to include photos, but in calling around to nonprofits and such, I found that all of the Harrisburg Patriot News's photos, their entire archive had been wiped out in the flood. So there was nothing existing before 1972. But I found out from the Harrisburg Historic Society that our offices on 3rd Street they now house an an ice cream shop called Urban Churn. The Historic Society is on 3rd Street. The major bookstore called Midtown Scholar is also on 3rd Street. But next door to our offices, there's a small newspaper, a nonprofit newspaper called The Berg. So The Berg wrote a story on the book. The book was read by various people who are still connected to Harrisburg. Among them was the daughter of Judge Herman of the trial. And I'm pleased to learn that she was on the Zoom call at the launch. Thank you, Melissa. And she sent it. She sent the article and my information to the local attorney who represented the Harrisburg defendants, and he's now in Florida. At the end of the book, I mentioned that one of the priests, we couldn't really track him down, but thought that he'd had an antique shop for many years after he left the priesthood. That was Tony Skoblick. Well, we couldn't find him, but my college roommate, Nancy Sugar, read the book and she said, oh, he's my neighbor in Baltimore. So she gave him the book and he wanted to talk to me. I talked to him and he really liked the book. And he apologizes for not being able to join the Zoom call, but he had a death in the family. So it was just really so cool. And it also put me in touch with many members of the HIP staff. The paper went on for about 8 years after me, and after we were there. And a few weeks ago, the Berg reporter, who happens to be 23 years old, which is the age I was when I was reporting from 3rd Street in Harrisburg, she wrote a story on how so many of us are still friends 50 years later. I will say I'm not 100% sure Fred is still speaking to me, but I haven't been sued yet. So here we are. In the audience for the launch were many people from the Harrisburg Independent Press. One of my friends I knew in nursery school who was there, friends from work over all these years. And to me, it kind of feels like we've come full circle. I mean, on the grand scale, we're re-experiencing the divisiveness. We're seeing the abortion debate, war, blood, famine, not a nice place to return to. But also with the book and this launch, we're seeing friends. We're getting a good sense of history. We've got a good story. And just getting back in touch has been just really lovely. And what I hope is that the book shows how each of us and good journalism can make a difference for a lifetime. So thank you. I hope you like the book.